another photography tutorial. In this video, we're going to learn about exposure compensation.
So then what is exposure compensation exactly? Well, basically your camera is programmed to calculate the overall brightness of the scene based on your current aperture, shutter speed, and ISO settings. Exposure compensation therefore allows you to finesse the way your camera responds to the light that's entering your camera. The Canon exposure compensation readout, or light evaluation meter, on Rebel cameras is a scale that goes from -5 to +5 stops of light and is found at the bottom of your screen here when in live view mode, or on the screen here when you're using the viewfinder. The little box right here identifies your current level, but to change exposure compensation, hold down the AV +- button and scroll with your index finger. The value changes in fractional 1/3 increments, where each number represents a full stop of light. Right in the middle is considered middle gray, or technically a properly balanced exposure. If you adjust the meter to the right into the positives, that's considered being overexposed, and if you adjust the meter to the left into the negatives, that's known as being underexposed. But the most important thing to take note of here is that just because it lands on 0 does not guarantee a quality image. Just treat 0 as a starting point. The way the image looks in the end is going to be completely up to you. I point a lot. So by using exposure compensation, you're basically telling the camera that you don't need to listen to it, and that it can take its middle gray, 0 on the meter, well-balanced exposure and shovel it from Demolition Man. Sandra Bullock, no?
To explain what I mean, let's take a look at a backlit scenario where an exposure value of 0 may not be ideal. This first picture was taken with my exposure compensation at 0. The image looks okay, but I was really just using it as a reference or starting point, and then I was going to adjust from there. For my second photo, I wanted to expose for the subject, so I needed to adjust my value to the right as I wanted a brighter image. According to the meter, I was overexposed, but the camera doesn't know that that's the image that you actually want. For my third photo, I wanted to create more of a silhouette type look, so I needed to expose for the outside by adjusting my value to the left, making the image darker or underexposed for everything inside.
But to be honest, it really boils down to this. Anytime that you are sharing the decision-making responsibilities with the camera for your exposure settings, then you should be using exposure compensation, which basically means that you're not using it when you're in full automatic or when you're in manual. So you can't use exposure compensation when you're on automatic, as the light evaluation meter is nowhere to be found because the camera is making all the exposure decisions. That's why full automatic is trosh. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, when you're shooting in full manual, there's also no such thing as exposure compensation. You will still see the light evaluation meter, but instead of setting your value and allowing the camera to compensate, now you're in control of everything. So if I click the shutter release down a little bit, you can see that the little box shows up, but now it moves as we change our settings. Because in manual, we're in complete control of our exposure settings, meaning the camera is not part of the decision making at all.
So that just leaves priority modes as the gateway to exposure compensation. You can think of the priority modes as part manual, where you control some settings, and part automatic, where the camera controls others. On Canon Rebel cameras, there's 3 priority modes: AV, TV, and P. For AV, or aperture priority, you control the aperture and the camera controls the shutter speed, and ISO if you switch it to auto. Notice that when I push the shutter release down a little bit, the camera will automatically calculate the shutter speed at 1/100 for an exposure value of 0. When I lower my exposure, you can see that the camera automatically adjusts with a faster shutter speed. But when I keep the exposure the same and adjust my aperture, the shutter speed will now compensate to maintain the current exposure value. You should use AV when you want full control over your depth of field and when movement isn't a concern, like for portraits. Our next priority mode is TV, or shutter priority, where you control the shutter speed and the camera controls the aperture and the ISO if you switch it to auto. Notice that this time when I push down the shutter release, the camera will automatically calculate the aperture at f5 for an exposure value of 0. When I lower my exposure, the camera will again compensate, but this time raising the aperture since we're in control of shutter speed. But when I keep the exposure the same and then adjust my shutter speed, the aperture will compensate to maintain the current exposure value. If you crank your shutter speed too high and your aperture starts blinking,
and your image won't get any brighter, it's because each lens has a limit on how wide their aperture can open. Use TV for action and movement or when depth of field doesn't really matter, like sports. The third mode is P, or program, and is essentially ISO priority, where you control the ISO and the camera controls shutter speed and aperture. This time when I push down the shutter release, the camera will calculate both shutter speed and aperture in combination for the exposure value of 0. When I lower my exposure, you'll see that the camera will now compensate with both settings to achieve the desired darker image. But when I keep my exposure the same and then change my ISO, both shutter speed and aperture will change to compensate. Use P or program mode when you're only concerned with exposure and really nothing else. So essentially you just gotta Goldilocks it until you get it just right for what you want. To do that, simply follow these 8 steps. Step 1. Make sure you're on the priority mode that suits your shooting needs. For example, I'm going to select AV or aperture priority because I'm taking a portrait and there's no movement. Step 2. Adjust the exposure setting that is your priority. So for me, it's aperture in this case. Since I want a blurry background, I'm going to select a low f1.8 aperture. Step 3. Decide whether you want to have ISO on auto or in manual. Step 4. Set your exposure compensation to 0, right in the middle. Step 5, double check your other settings like white balance and picture quality. Step 6, take a picture. Step 7, evaluate the image. So is it too bright, is it too dark, or is it just right? And then finally, step 8, adjust your exposure compensation up or down until you get the look that you want. And then have at her. But I have one more little trick for complicated or like mixed lighting scenarios where you're having a tough time deciding on your exposure compensation level. It's actually not really a trick, it's just using exposure bracketing. To use exposure bracketing on your camera, just go into Menu and go to the second red menu at the very top. Click Set, and then all you have to do, like right now it shows our exposure value at 0, but if you hold AV and you scroll with your index finger, you can see that it separates into 3 now, 3 separate ones. One picture will be taken at exposure 0, one at -2, and one at +2. Hit Set, then click Menu to get out, and then click on Drive Mode, the button that's left of Set, and make sure you're on continuous shooting. Now, when you hold down the shutter release, it's going to take 3 pictures. And if we click Play, we can see that if we go back, 1 was taken at exposure 0, 1 was taken at 2 below, up at the top there you can see, and 1 was at +2. You can use this trick to take 3 pictures at once and then pick the best one. One thing to take note of here is that your exposure compensation remembers where it was last set, even when you turn your camera off. So if you turn your camera back on, you start taking some pictures and you're like, hey, they're too dark or they're too bright. It's because you forgot to take care of your exposure compensation. So in the end, just remember that there's no correct image or exposure. The look that you want is completely up to you. My suggestion is to practice by taking a variety of photos, some that are balanced, some that are overexposed, some that are under, until you develop a greater understanding of light and how to adjust your camera settings to compensate. Which, besides being a very useful thing to know how to use on your camera, exposure compensation is also a great bridge for those who want to move from only using their camera in automatic to manual. That's all I got for exposure compensation. If you got something out of this video or you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, and I will catch you next time.